I'm CP, and welcome to the first episode of Help I'm Teaching, a podcast for amateur educators. This podcast is intended for people who aren't teachers by trade, but are going to be in a situation where they need to teach something. For example, maybe you volunteered at a nonprofit or a school program to teach fourth graders about the water cycle, and you're pretty sure you covered the water cycle before, but you'd like a quick refresher, as well as some fun facts, analogies, and avenues for further exploration, so you can be a step above just reciting a Wikipedia article off your phone. Of course, if you're an actual teacher, I hope that you could also gain a new perspective on something you've taught dozens of times. It's my goal that by the time you finish listening, you won't just be confident in teaching the topic, you'll be excited. I'm beginning my own teaching career, where I sometimes have to juggle a lot of different topics, and I wish it could be easier than cramming YouTube videos, browsing scientific literature, and Googling questions to make sure I'm saying the right thing. My background is in plant biology and biomedical science, so I can dip into ecology, general biology, maybe a bit of chemistry and human physiology, but I could definitely contact specialists for other topics. It's never going to rise above the high school level and probably won't rise far past middle school. I thought I'd start with something near and dear to my heart, photosynthesis. I'm going to give an overview, dispel some common myths, and talk about some hypotheticals that might be asked by the more curious kids. So let's get started. Most of this section comes from LibreText's Microbiology Textbook 5.11 sections A, B, and C, but I'll leave the transcript along with other sources in the show notes. I recommend starting off by talking about the world's oldest terrarium. It was made in 1960 by David Latimer when he put compost, water, and spiderwort into a sealed glass orb. The spiderwort plants are still alive to this day, and he has only added water once since 1972. You can use this to get kids thinking about what's produced and consumed inside the terrarium, and why that doesn't work with animals. Then you have a good basis to start talking about photosynthesis itself. Photosynthesis is the process by which plants produce energy using sunlight. It can be expressed as sunlight plus water plus carbon dioxide equals glucose and oxygen, or for the older kids, 6 H2O molecules plus 6 CO2 molecules give 1 glucose molecule and 6 oxygen molecules. The reason the equation is done in sixes is because the chemical formula of glucose is C6H12O6, and the equation needs to have the same numbers of molecules on both sides, though you can drop the sixes if no one's doing chemistry. Carbon dioxide enters the plant through underside leaf openings called stomata, while water enters through the roots. Sunlight is absorbed via organelles called chloroplasts, containing a pigment called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll absorbs all wavelengths of light except green, which it reflects. This is what makes plant leaves green. As for the products, the glucose, or food, is stored in the plant for later use, and the oxygen leaves the plant through the stomata. Photosynthesis is important because in most cases, it's the ultimate source of energy for life on the planet. Life requires energy, and that first enters the ecological environment when plants use the power of the sun to create food. When animals eat plants, they're ultimately taking energy from the sun, and if those animals are eaten, the same is true of their predators. Energy flow in ecosystems can, in almost all cases, be traced back to the sun. Photosynthesis also adds oxygen to our atmosphere. If you've ever heard of the Cambrian explosion, it's the relatively sudden appearance of life more complex than single-celled organisms, and one hypothesis is that it was caused by oxygen from photosynthesis, allowing life to evolve more efficient means of energy generation. Okay, so you probably know all that already. Now let's get to the interesting stuff. Here's some things kids sometimes think about photosynthesis and plants. The first thing I want to address is that plants do not only produce oxygen, they produce carbon dioxide as well. This is through cellular respiration, the same method we use to make energy from our food. Think of it like this. In the day, when a plant has access to sunlight, it uses that energy to produce glucose and oxygen from carbon dioxide and water. Glucose is a way of storing energy. At night, when sunlight isn't available, the plant makes carbon dioxide and water as waste products from the breakdown of glucose to produce energy. Plants also respire during the day, but it's a lot more pronounced at night. If a plant only made oxygen, it wouldn't be possible to keep sealed terrariums going very long, because all the carbon dioxide would be quickly made into oxygen and the plant would starve. For example, the oxygen in David Latimer's terrarium has definitely cycled quite a few times. Where does the mass of a plant come from? This is one I'll never forget because my 7th grade science teacher got my whole class with it. In photosynthesis, the mass of the growing plant, as in the bark, wood, fruit, and leaves, comes from carbon dioxide and not water. I think the reason this one is common is it can be a bit hard to conceptualize plants growing from an invisible gas in the air. Water is still required for the reaction, it leaves as oxygen, and it is crucial for plant growth and maintenance, but it is not where plant mass comes from. Not a perfect analogy, but think of it like water being boiled to spin a turbine, with the turbine spinning representing plant growth. Water is used and it leaves altered as steam, but it is used to allow the conversion of heat into spinning the turbine. It's not the direct source of energy. Sunlight is the same. Saying it's plant food is a good way to introduce the idea, but its real purpose is to drive chemical reactions in the plant that eventually produce glucose, and it is never converted directly into plant mass. Plants also take nutrients from the soil, but they do not use it as energy. In the 17th century, a scientist named Jan van Helmont weighed a tree and the dry soil he would plant it in. After 5 years, he reweighed both. The tree had grown considerably, but the soil had lost barely any weight. The reason for this is that the nutrition plants get from the soil is like vitamin supplements for humans. You don't consume vitamins to directly break them down into energy, but they serve as important reagents and enzymes in biological processes that create energy. Anyone who tried to live on only supplements would get hungry really fast, but in many cases they're a good addition to a diet. If nutrients haven't been moved to an organ that humans remove for food, like a fruit or a tuber, putting the dead plant back into the soil can actually return some of those nutrients for the next plant to use. Leaves aren't the only part of a plant that can photosynthesize. Odds are, if it's green, such as the stem of a growing plant, it has chlorophyll and can perform limited photosynthesis as well. As some plants mature, they don't need the extra energy and swap out the chlorophyll for protective and structural tissues like bark. In fact, some plants in hot environments mainly use stems to photosynthesize, as using leaves risks opening the stomata and losing precious water. Is sunlight always good for a plant? Surprisingly, no. Too much sun will cause the plant to produce reactive oxygen species, which are toxic. You know how you hear about antioxidants in food from plants? Those antioxidants are meant to counteract the creation of these. Some species actually prefer less direct sunlight, which I'm sure you know if you've ever seen the shade plant section at a garden store. This next one isn't directly related to photosynthesis, but it's about plants and one a lot of people have. It's the idea that adding any kind of organic matter directly to the soil, like food waste and human waste, is always good for the plant. Those of you who have tried composting have probably heard the term carbon-nitrogen ratio, and anything you add to a pile is higher in one of these two. If the waste is high in carbon, like dead leaves or twigs, microorganisms will use nitrogen in the soil to decompose them, nitrogen that could be used by plants for growth. And if the waste is high in nitrogen, like coffee grounds, finished compost, and food scraps, you risk damaging the roots of the plant by adding too much salt and causing what's known as fertilizer burn. Watering heavily can help flush the salt away, but it's always easier to just apply fertilizer or organics pretty sparingly. Now here's some stuff the more curious kids might ask. If chlorophyll is green and needed for photosynthesis, how do plants with different colored leaves photosynthesize? All leaves have chlorophyll, and for these plants, the chlorophyll is masked by another pigment like a red anthocyanin or an orange carotenoid. This could be for absorbing light at different wavelengths than green, or for ecological purposes like pollinator attraction. Those pigments are present in most green leaves as well, and are the reason leaves change color in the fall. During fall, when leaves receive less sunlight, the green chlorophyll starts to break down, leaving behind the orange, yellow, and red pigments. Why does photosynthesis only work with sunlight? Why doesn't it work with a light bulb? Not all light is equal. Remember when I said that plants are green because chlorophyll only reflects green light and absorbs the rest? The most critical wavelengths of light for a plant are blue and red, which are not emitted by most light sources like flashlights and light bulbs that aren't specifically designed for it. Is there only one kind of photosynthesis? Excess heat and sunlight can cause the plant to waste a lot of energy and water, especially in hotter environments. Special kinds of photosynthesis called C4 photosynthesis and CAM photosynthesis have evolved to prevent the waste. Some examples of plants that photosynthesize this way are corn for C4 and pineapples for CAM. However, they require slightly more energy to function than normal or C3 photosynthesis, and they don't evolve in places where they're not needed. It would be like if you constantly held an umbrella in one hand, even if the weather was fine. An umbrella is useful in bad weather, but you'd be limiting yourself to just one hand if you carried it all the time. Why don't humans photosynthesize? Simply put, we just use way too much energy. Photosynthesis produces roughly 100 to 200 calories per day and works as a sole strategy for plants because they mostly stay put. The average person needs about 2,000 to 2,500 calories a day and much more if you are very active. Also, photosynthesis works because plant leaves are designed to have a high surface area to capture sunlight above them. As far as humans go, if we only had chlorophyll on our shoulders and tops of our heads, we wouldn't make very much energy at all. Where did photosynthesis come from? You know those fish that find a shark and attach itself to it for their entire life? Photosynthesis evolved a bit like that, though it would be more like if the shark was born with the fish already attached to it. Scientists think that chloroplasts, the photosynthetic machinery of modern-day plant cells, used to be an independent life form like a bacteria. These bacteria discovered they could live inside bigger cells and benefit both itself with protection and the bigger cell with extra energy. Over millions of years, this odd couple eventually became totally reliant on each other. As proof, unique single-stranded DNA not found in plant cells can be found in chloroplasts, suggesting they used to be their own single-celled organisms. Do seeds photosynthesize? When seeds first germinate, they're using stored food and do not have the capacity to perform photosynthesis yet. Seeds store food in structures called cotyledons. When that first leaf or two emerges from the seed, those are cotyledons. Depending on the plant, the cotyledons can begin photosynthesis or may fall off as more leaves develop. If your students have time, you can see the cotyledons emerge by wrapping an uncooked bean in a moist tissue paper and making sure it doesn't dry out. In about a week, the bean will germinate and the stem and cotyledons will rise out of it. If climate change increases atmospheric carbon dioxide, will that help plants grow better? I tried to do a project on this one to be optimistic, but got my hopes shattered pretty quickly. Short answer, yes, more carbon dioxide means more photosynthesis can happen. But it's a bit more complicated than that. The main limiting factor in plant growth is nitrogen in the soil, so if the soil isn't good, the plant can't use that extra carbon dioxide. Furthermore, the negative effects of climate change, like more frequent temperature extremes, would be a lot worse for the plant than the benefits of increased carbon dioxide. Also, crops grown at higher carbon dioxide concentrations often have reduced protein and mineral content. What organisms don't have sunlight as their primary energy source? I mentioned above that most organisms have the sun to thank for their source of energy. However, some bacteria can get energy from the compounds found in deep sea vents like sulfur and nitrogen. Also, some microorganisms in the soil can convert nitrogen from one form to another for energy, and these microorganisms are essential in providing plant roots with usable nitrogen. For the more physics-minded, scientists are now speculating that photosynthesis efficiency comes from some poorly understood quantum mechanics. I know it's a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot to explain everything, and I'm not much of a physics guy myself, but in short, the idea is that quantum mechanics can allow for weird movements of electrons during photosynthesis, allowing them to take shortcuts in photosynthetic pathways. This just goes to show how long nature has been fine-tuning this system. Well, that's everything I have for this episode. Of course, if someone asks something that isn't covered here, always encourage them to research the answer at a library or online. In some cases, they might even be able to run an experiment to see for themselves, like seeing how shade plant growth compares to full sun plants in full sunlight. I'd like to end on a famous quote by Paul Harvey: "Man owes his existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains." I think it'll really drive home the idea that plants are the entry point of energy into the entire planetary ecosystem, and it also just sounds cool. Maybe just replace rains with suns. And that's my first episode of Help I'm Teaching. I hope you learned a lot of interesting facts about photosynthesis you can share with whoever you're teaching, whether it's kindergartners, 4th graders, or yourself. Sources and the transcript of this episode will be in the show notes. See you next time.